The fog rolled down from the ridges as if the mountain itself exhaled a slow, heavy breath. It crept between the rocks and flowed into the pass like liquid, filling every hollow, clinging to every branch, and softening the sharp lines of the landscape. Trees became ghostly shapes, half there and half imagined, their forms shifting as the mist curled and reshaped itself. The world shrank until only a gray veil remained, thick and impenetrable, turning the mountain pass into a world detached from time. In that suspended silence, the fog carried the weight of expectation, heavy and suffocating, as though nature itself knew what was coming. The pines loomed overhead with the gravity of ancient witnesses. Their trunks stood in rigid ranks, tall and stern, while their crowns swayed and whispered secrets high above. The wind threaded through their branches, making a sound that was neither voice nor sigh, but something uncanny. A murmur that stirred unease even among seasoned soldiers. Resin scented the damp air, sharp and earthy, mixing with the musk of wet needles underfoot. Every step pressed into that carpet of decay and silence. The forest floor swallowing sound until even deliberate movement seemed to vanish into nothing. They were no longer in a place of wilderness alone, but inside a chamber of judgment, where the trees themselves waited to see who would endure and who would not. Major Elena Cross crouched low among her rangers, her figure blending into the gloom yet unmistakable to those who followed her. Her braid hung like a dark cord against her back, tight and precise, a mark of discipline that mirrored her every motion. Beneath the combat harness and the rugged weight of her ranger kit, the outline of her green flight suit clung to her frame, a remnant of the skies she once commanded. The patch of her nation's flag lay on her shoulder, its edges worn but intact, a silent emblem of duty that bound her here. Her face was calm, eyes sharp and unwavering, her poise an anchor to men who might otherwise feel swallowed by the ghostly silence. To her rangers, she was more than an officer. She was steadiness itself, the proof that even in a place where visibility ended at an arm's length, there was someone who could still see the way forward. From deep in the pass came the muted growl of engines, faint at first but steady, layered and rhythmic. The clank of armored plates carried upward, distorted as though the sound did not travel straight but twisted and scattered through unseen corridors of stone. Boots struck hard earth, their cadence swallowed before it could settle, leaving only fragments that hinted at numbers. Metal chains rattled briefly, then dissolved into the mist like whispers overheard, but quickly lost. The convoy was near, moving into the choke point, its presence betrayed by sounds that seemed both close and far, as if the fog itself had chosen to deceive them. Her rangers lay silent, spread across ground they had memorized until it felt like home. Each soldier rested steady hands on weapons polished by use, muzzles waiting like predators' eyes. Breaths were taken in controlled rhythm, shallow enough to vanish into the air without a trace. They did not speak, did not shift, did not betray their presence. For every man trusted the woman at their center to decide when silence would end. The forest seemed to lean inward with them, the pines swaying as if listening, their great trunks like dark pillars marking the edge of a hidden cathedral. Elena pressed her cheek to the cool stock of her rifle, her eye peering through glass that cut a circle of clarity in a world drowned in gray. Through the scope, shapes began to emerge, vague outlines of trucks, faint movement of men on foot, shifting shadows carrying weapons of their own. The fog obscured detail, hiding faces, hiding numbers, but it could not conceal vulnerability. The scope's circle pierced the deception, showing her fragments of truth, enough for judgment. Around her the forest grew tighter, the air colder, the silence more absolute. The trap was not merely set in explosives or rifles. It lived in the fog that blinded, in the echoes that confused, in the silence that smothered the last comfort of the human voice. Elena's presence turned those elements into weapons, her will aligning man and nature alike. The forest seemed complicit, its needles dripping moisture like beads of anticipation, its soil ready to absorb the blood it would soon drink. The pines watched like ancient judges, and the fog hung like a veil of death, promising that those who entered would never again find their way out. The light in the briefing tent had been dim, the kind that pressed shadows into corners and made even familiar faces seem hollowed by fatigue. A map lay across the table, its creases worn, the valleys and ridges traced in dark pencil lines that cut like scars through the paper. Grease pencils scratched in silence as paths were marked, routes circled, and danger points underlined with a hand that never trembled. When the orders came, they were as simple as they were cruel: delay the enemy battalion for 12 hours, no matter the cost. Major Elena Cross studied the map as if it were not lines and ink, but destiny itself. She traced the pass with one finger, the choke point where the road narrowed into the mountain's throat. If the enemy armor broke through here, the valley would not hold. Allied positions would collapse under steel and fire, and towns scattered beyond would feel the march of boots and treads. The weight of thousands of lives pressed upon the quiet interior of the tent. Yet she accepted it without hesitation. There was no promise of rescue and no expectation of retreat. She knew from the way her commander spoke that this assignment was less an order than a sentence, an acknowledgement that her rangers would be outnumbered and outgunned. Still, she gave no argument. Her silence was not submission but steel, and it carried more than any oath could. When she nodded her understanding, the conversation ended. Fate had already been drawn across the paper. In the hours that followed, her men began the ritual of preparation. Rifles were broken down and reassembled with practiced speed, every spring and pin checked twice. Suppressors were fitted with care, each thread aligned until the metal settled without the faintest imperfection. Explosives were weighed and wrapped, blasting caps sealed against moisture. Radios were tested, signals confirmed in clipped whispers that faded as quickly as they were spoken. There was banter among the men, though it carried an edge like a blade wrapped in cloth, a joke about the fog rolling in faster than their nerves, a muttered quip about the enemy convoy taking its time. Laughter rose, brief and sharp, then vanished into silence, each man knowing the humor was not for joy, but survival. In their quiet moments, eyes flicked to Elena, finding in her composure a mirror to hold themselves steady. She moved among them without hurry, every motion deliberate, as though time itself bent to her pace. Her braid lay over her shoulder, damp with the night air, her green flight suit visible beneath the harness and plates she wore. She checked weapons without words. A touch here, a glance there, her approval given with the smallest nod. The men steadied under her gaze, their tension easing not because danger lessened, but because they trusted her to carry it for them. When she spoke, it was with the same calm that had guided them through every trial before. She reminded them of their discipline, of the advantage given by silence, of the truth that the forest itself could be turned into an ally. Her words were not loud, yet each man leaned closer, as if the fog itself sought to steal her voice. They rose from her presence less like soldiers walking toward battle, and more like hunters prepared to vanish into the trees. The work of setting the ambush began as the fog thickened, and the mountain air carried a weight that felt almost ceremonial. Mines were buried beneath wet pine needles, their shapes concealed by careful hands that treated them like seeds planted in dark soil. Trip flares were rigged along narrow paths, their wires strung low, invisible to the untrained eye. Every action was measured, every step leaving no trace, as though they built not a battlefield, but a snare spun by nature itself. Cross oversaw the placement with the precision of an artist laying brushstrokes. She corrected angles, repositioned charges, and adjusted lines of fire until each ranger's position melted into the terrain. Her men whispered only when necessary, and even then, the sound seemed swallowed by the fog. Together, they wove a pattern of death across the pass, invisible to those who would stumble into it unaware. By the time the first light touched the ridge, the trap had been set, and the forest lay in waiting. A mist hung over the ground like a veil, concealing their preparations beneath a blanket of gray. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of anticipation, broken only by the distant roll of engines carried through the pass. The convoy was coming, and the jaws of the mountain were ready to close. The explosion shattered the stillness in a single violent breath. Mines buried beneath the damp needles erupted with a force that hurled dirt, fire, and broken steel into the air. The lead truck lifted from the ground as though seized by an unseen giant, its frame twisting apart before crashing down in ruin. The fog glowed with sudden flame, orange light rolling like a storm through the gray. Behind it, a second vehicle jolted forward into disaster. A second mine tore through its belly, spilling men and twisted metal across the path. The road became an inferno of shattered wheels and burning fuel. The mountain itself convulsing as if struck by thunder, smoke mixed with fog until sight became useless. A wall of gray and black veined with sudden sparks. The convoy halted in chaos, brakes screeching and engines roaring as drivers struggled to understand what had struck them. Soldiers spilled out of the trucks, rifles raised, shouts colliding in the mist. The pass magnified every cry, carrying voices in strange directions, so no one knew where commands truly came from. They crouched low, eyes wide, ears ringing, surrounded by fire yet blinded by fog. Then came the first volley of precision fire. Suppressed shots whispered from the tree line, their impact far louder than their release. Enemy officers crumpled where they stood, red blooming on gray uniforms. Their words cut short in their throats. One by one, the heads of command toppled, and the spine of order broke before it could form. Another officer shouted, pointing toward the tree line, but a single bullet found him before his men could follow. His body pitched forward into the mud, arms flung wide, his voice swallowed by the mist. Confusion spread like disease, soldiers searching for leadership and finding only corpses. The chain of command unraveled strand by strand until nothing held them together. Elena Cross scanned through her rifle scope, eyes narrowing as she tracked the silhouettes of men trying to regroup. Her finger tightened, and another figure dropped, collapsing beside the burning wreckage of a truck. Around her, her rangers mirrored her control. Every shot deliberate, every target chosen with purpose. She was the still point in the storm, directing death without a word. The enemy panicked. Soldiers fired wildly into the trees, their rounds cracking against bark and stone, sending splinters flying in directions their targets had never stood. The pass answered them with echoes, each gunshot bouncing between cliffs, creating the illusion of dozens more enemies than were truly there. Fear mounted as they realized the mist betrayed them at every turn. Voices rose in frantic orders, some commanding retreat, others demanding advance, none clear in origin. Echoes twisted words into nonsense, sending squads into confusion. Some fired at the shadows of their own comrades, the fog transforming friend into phantom. Discipline fractured into desperation, men shouting over one another, each certain he was obeying the right voice. Flashes of gunfire bloomed like ghostly sparks in the fog, bright for a moment before vanishing into gray. Screams followed, brief and sharp, swallowed quickly as though the air itself refused to carry them. Figures lunged through the mist only to be cut down by unseen hands. Panic hardened into terror as the forest became a place where death struck without warning or face. Through it all, Elena moved her rangers with quiet mastery. She raised a hand, signaled a sweep to the left, and two men vanished into mist without sound. A flick of her wrist shifted a squad forward, their boots muffled against damp earth as if they floated above it. Every gesture was exact. every choice designed to tighten the trap. Her calm stood in brutal contrast to the chaos unraveling below. While enemy soldiers screamed and fired into emptiness, her squad slipped between positions, unseen, unfelt, until they struck again. Elena's eyes glimmered with focus, her breath steady, her rifle an extension of her will. To her men, she was not only a leader, but the embodiment of the phantom they had been ordered to become. The battle stretched into a pattern of echoes and illusions. Enemy lines staggered, each attempt at regrouping shattered by a shot placed with surgical precision. Grenades rolled uselessly down slopes, exploding far from their imagined targets. Every moment the enemy remained in the pass was another moment their numbers dwindled, consumed by fear and fire. Finally, after the last suppressed shots fell silent, the pass seemed to exhale again. The fog closed its curtain over the burning hulks of vehicles, swallowing light and leaving only faint glows within the gray. The shouts dwindled into whimpers, the gunfire into occasional desperate bursts, then into nothing at all. What remained was silence, vast and heavy, as though the forest itself demanded stillness after the storm. The first mortar round whistled down through the mist with a sound that rattled the teeth. It struck the hillside above the convoy and erupted in a burst of soil, stone, and fire. Shards of rock and shrapnel whined through the air, some clattering against truck frames, others embedding themselves into the trunks of trees. The fog, already thick, absorbed the blast with eerie calm, its curtain closing almost as quickly as it had opened. More mortars followed, each one booming like thunder as they rained blind punishment into the pass. Explosions lit the mist in sickly flashes, shadows leaping and vanishing with every detonation. Infantry crouched low as they advanced behind the barrage, their rifles trembling in nervous hands. The mountain trembled under the weight of their fire, yet nothing visible answered them. The enemy commander barked orders that cracked like whips, his voice sharp with desperation. He drove his men forward in staggered lines, urging them to flush out what he insisted were only a handful of hidden foes. Boots trampled over churned earth, slipping on mud, slick with fuel and blood. Bayonets glinted as soldiers pushed into the gray, eyes wide as they peered into emptiness. From the trees above, Elena Cross gave a subtle signal, and the forest itself seemed to answer. A hidden charge cut loose a tree trunk, sending it crashing across the path with a roar like breaking bones. The men below scattered in panic, convinced for a moment that the mountain itself sought to crush them. Their cohesion faltered again as they scrambled to regroup, rifles waving toward the wrong shadows. Moments later, a trip flare hissed to life, painting the mist in pale fire. Figures shouted and fired wildly into the blaze, believing they had found their enemy. Yet there was nothing there but empty ground and the broken echo of their own panic. Cross had turned their fear against them, and the trap deepened with every wasted bullet. A recording of ranger voices carried through the fog, fragments of commands drifting like disembodied ghosts. The words were indistinct, bouncing against the cliffs until no one knew where they began or ended. Soldiers fired toward the sound, advancing into hollows where no foe waited. In chasing echoes, they only drove themselves deeper into the jaws of the unseen. One squad, separated from the main body, never realized how close the Rangers had drawn. Suppressed rifles whispered once, twice, 3 times, and men folded into the earth before their comrades even registered the sound. Their bodies disappeared into the mist as if swallowed whole. To those who survived, it seemed their fellows had simply vanished. Another patrol moved cautiously, their rifles twitching in every direction. A figure at the rear dropped suddenly, a neat hole drilled through his helmet, his legs kicking once before falling still. The others whirled, firing into shadows that held no enemy, only branches swaying gently in the fog. By the time they dared to look forward again, 2 more had vanished. The suppressed fire continued in rhythm, steady and unrelenting, like a predator picking off prey too slow to flee. Soldiers cried out names, then fell silent when no answer came. The forest grew heavier with their fear, each step they took accompanied by the certainty that eyes watched from everywhere. Cross's rangers became wraiths, striking unseen, gone before the enemy could return a single effective shot. It was then that the whispers began. Soldiers muttered to each other in strained voices, calling the unseen foe by a new name. The Wraith, they said. As if speaking, it gave shape to the terror stalking them. Fear spread more quickly than bullets, weaving through the ranks until no one trusted what they saw. Men fired at shadows cast by their own flares. Convinced shapes moved where there was only fog. Every echo of gunfire magnified their dread, as if the cliffs themselves mocked them with hollow laughter. Even the sound of their own boots seemed suspect, each crunch magnified into the steps of an invisible pursuer. The mist had become alive in their minds, a presence that hunted them without form. The enemy commander shouted for discipline, but his words could not reach hearts already broken by fear. He ordered advances, yet men froze in place, eyes darting in every direction. He demanded silence, yet whispers of the Wraith carried on the wind. What began as an army was now a gathering of frightened individuals, each struggling to decide whether to obey or survive. At last, the cohesion snapped. A small cluster of soldiers broke from the line and fled into the woods, their figures swallowed by branches before anyone could stop them. Others followed moments later, slipping away into the mist with weapons clutched tight but no thought of fighting and also... Their desertion spread like fire in dry grass, pulling more and more into the grip of panic. By the time the fog thickened into its heaviest veil, the enemy force no longer resembled an organized battalion. They were fragments scattered across the pass, firing sporadically at ghosts that did not exist. Cross watched through her scope, her expression unreadable, her mind already calculating the next step. Around her, her rangers remained unseen, the forest itself their ally, as the enemy crumbled without ever truly seeing what struck them. The roar of armored engines shook the pass as the enemy rallied in fury. Heavy vehicles rolled forward through the wreckage, their turrets turning toward the tree line with mechanical precision. Cannon fire erupted, shells streaking into the forest, detonation splintering trunks into jagged shards. The fog lit with violent bursts, each explosion tearing holes in the gray veil. Mortars joined the assault, their descending whistles slicing through the air like cruel laughter. Rounds crashed into the ground with concussive blasts, shaking soil loose from the slopes. Pines shuddered under the rain of fire, branches falling in fiery arcs. The battlefield that had been hidden was now exposed, ripped open by steel and fury. One ranger squad caught the brunt of it, pinned between falling trees and pounding artillery. Their cover shredded around them, and every movement risked being their last. Voices on the comms carried sharp edges of fear, yet discipline held as they called out positions and requested suppressing fire. The enemy pressed hard, sensing weakness at last. Machine guns roared from the armored vehicles, cutting through undergrowth in sweeping lines. The pinned squad huddled low, firing only in desperate bursts to keep the enemy at bay. Smoke and dust thickened with the fog, turning every breath into a choking effort. They were trapped, and seconds were running out. Elena Cross heard their voices through the calm but strained, and she made her decision before hesitation could grow. She signaled for covering fire, her orders crisp and measured despite the chaos. Her men answered instantly, unleashing a volley to force the enemy into cover. Then, she broke from her position and dashed toward the trapped squad. She sprinted through the churned mud, explosions erupting in her wake, bark and stones slashing across her path. Bullets cracked through branches above, one slicing close enough to tug at the braid on her back. She slid into cover beside her men, her rifle already snapping into position. Her presence steadied them, a reminder that even under the storm, their leader stood with them. Coordinating quickly, she directed suppressing fire in short bursts, her hand signals sharp and deliberate. Rangers shifted their fire toward the armored vehicles, forcing turrets to pivot and giving seconds of breathing space. Grenades arced through the air, bursting against advancing infantry and scattering them back. The squad began to move, crawling and sprinting in bursts under her direction. But fate reached for her in that moment. A mortar exploded against a slope just yards away, the blast sending shards of rock and steel slicing through the air. A jagged piece of shrapnel cut across her side, hot pain tearing through flesh as it grazed her. She staggered, but did not fall. Her jaw clenched as blood dampened her suit beneath the harness. Her men saw it, eyes wide, but she waved them forward with a grim steadiness. Pain would not hold her down while others relied on her. She pressed her rifle tight to her shoulder, firing with icy control as she guided her squad out of the trap. The cost was hers to bear, and she accepted it without hesitation. As they regrouped behind a ridge, the world seemed to change. The fog that had cloaked them thinned under the weight of heat and fire, drifting apart into tatters. Sunlight pierced through in pale shafts, illuminating ground that had once been theirs alone. What had been a realm of ghosts was now bare and vulnerable, the advantage slipping like water through open hands. Elena Cross knew the enemy had to be drawn deeper, into the very throat of the pass. She rose from her cover for only seconds, letting herself be seen through drifting smoke. Bullets snapped past her, tearing bark and stone, but her figure was enough to bait them forward. Their commander roared for pursuit, convinced at last that he had cornered his elusive prey. The enemy pushed hard into the choke point, their armored vehicles grinding forward, infantry crowding close behind. The pass narrowed, walls of stone pressing tight on either side, blind to the trap waiting above. Elena signaled her engineers, a single sharp gesture in the haze. The ground seemed to hold its breath, waiting. A thunderous roar split the mountain as charges detonated in sequence. Cliffs convulsed, stone breaking loose in massive slabs that tumbled into the road with earth-shaking force. Pines toppled with the slides, their roots tearing free, trunks crashing like titans into the trapped column. The road sealed itself in smoke, rock, and ruin, cutting off retreat forever. Dust mixed with the fog until the air became a choking storm, silhouettes staggering in sudden blindness, vehicles smashed into fallen boulders, their armor dented and twisted under the weight of stone. Soldiers scrambled, shouting, firing into nothing as if the mist itself were their enemy. The convoy splintered into pockets of panic, cohesion destroyed in an instant. Then the Rangers struck. Suppressed rifles whispered through the smoke, each shot sharp with finality. Grenades rolled beneath vehicles, bursting in violent flashes that sent shrapnel slicing through clustered men. Knives found targets in the chaos. Silent deaths delivered at arm's length before bodies even fell. The fight collapsed into brutal close-quarters combat, faces appearing only at the instant of death. Pistols cracked in muffled bursts. Blades slid between ribs. Rifles fired at shadows only steps away. Screams were cut short, the mist swallowing them as quickly as they came. The pass became a slaughterhouse cloaked in fog. Elena fought among her men, her rifle steady, her commands clipped and sure. She struck with the same ruthless precision she had demanded from the first shot. To the enemy, she was nowhere, and everywhere. A phantom glimpsed only before death arrived. The trap had closed, and she guided it with unshakable resolve. Through the haze, the enemy commander rose above the ruin, his voice carrying over the broken echoes. He shouted for his soldiers to stand, calling them cowards, his defiance slicing through their fear. His figure loomed, rifle raised, his fury pulling stragglers back to his side. In him burned the last flicker of resistance. He charged forward, firing into the smoke, his men stumbling after him. His defiance turned him into a beacon, the only clear target in the chaos. Bullets sparked from stone near Elena as his shots tore past, closer with every pull of the trigger. His rage filled the pass with one final cry of command. Elena steadied her rifle, her breath measured even as pain burned at her side. Through the scope she saw him clearly, framed by fog and fire, the embodiment of a broken army's last will. One shot left the barrel, silent and precise, piercing him cleanly before the echo of his voice could fade. He fell without ceremony, swallowed by mist, and the battlefield stilled. When the last echo of gunfire faded, the mountain pass fell into silence once more. Smoke drifted in thin strands above the wrecks, folding into the heavier fog that rolled down from the ridges. Fires hissed and guttered out as damp air smothered the flames, leaving only faint orange glows inside the mist. The pines swayed gently overhead, their creaking boughs sounding like weary sighs after a long and bitter struggle. The ground was scarred by craters, gouged by shells, and blackened by fire, yet the forest began to reclaim it almost immediately. Moisture settled across the churned soil, softening edges and swallowing prints. The smell of resin returned, stronger than smoke, as if nature was eager to erase what had happened. Around the shattered remains of trucks and scattered weapons, the fog spread its veil, blurring the shapes of ruin until they seemed half-remembered. The rangers moved quietly among their own, tending to the wounded, counting the missing, and covering the fallen. No one spoke louder than a murmur, their grief carried in silence rather than sound. Rifles were laid across the bodies of the dead, each weapon set with reverence, a tribute as stark as any spoken word. Helmets were lowered, heads bowed, and the living honored the sacrifice of those who would never leave this pass. There was no ceremony, no ritual handed down, only the instinctive gestures of men who had walked too often with death. One ranger pressed a hand against the chest of a fallen comrade, holding it there until his own breathing steadied. Another placed a scarf over a lifeless face, hiding it from the fog that clung like a shroud. Together, they stood as a line, shoulder to shoulder, their silence heavier than gunfire. Elena Cross moved among them with a stillness that spoke more than any words could. Her side burned with the pain of her wound, yet she carried herself as though untouched, unwilling to add her weakness to the weight of their grief. She paused at each covered body, her hand brushing the rifle left in tribute, her eyes steady and unflinching. For every man she passed, she carried the memory of his courage as if it were her own burden to bear. When she stepped away from her soldiers, her gaze turned back to the battlefield itself. The enemy convoy lay shattered, twisted metal and broken bodies scattered where discipline had failed and fear had triumphed. Their commander, once defiant, was now nothing more than another shape lost in the gray. She thought of how they had spoken of the wraith in frightened whispers, and how quickly that name had become their truth. War, she knew, was never only about survival. It was about the memory of what lingered when silence returned. The fog would carry whispers of this night long after bodies rotted and wrecks rusted away, carrying forward the legend of unseen hunters who had turned the mountain itself into a weapon. Victory was measured not in the count of the dead but in the fear left to haunt the living. As the fog thickened again, Elena let it embrace her, the damp air clinging to her face and hair until she seemed more shadow than flesh. She walked into the trees with measured steps, her figure swallowed gradually by the mist. To her men she was still their commander, but to those who had faced her, she had become something less human and more enduring. By the time her outline vanished into the veil, the forest had claimed her presence, leaving only the legend of the wraith behind.